ask you, well, please fire away. From the University of Glamorgan, we met a couple of years ago, and I said, I think Daniel will be ideal to invite to one of our symposia, and your role today, I think you'll all agree that I have a very good criterion.
Well, there's nothing like a big build-up, so thank you for that, and thank you for giving me a tired, hungry audience, desperate for their lunch, who don't want to ask questions. I obviously should start by thanking you for the invitation, but I'm slightly reluctant to do so. This morning, as I was sitting quietly in the middle of the room, minding my own business, Miquel came up to me and said, "Are you ready?" And I said, "Yes, I'm as ready as I'm going to be." And he said, "Of course, you realise this is an impossible task." So, thank you for inviting me to do this impossible task. I shall do it as well as I can. Since we've been talking about intercultural communication, perhaps it is helpful to know where I'm coming from in terms of language and culture. I am English, I speak English, and am I multilingual? Maybe, maybe not. It depends exactly how you choose to define that. Culturally, I would consider myself to be English, as opposed to British, for example. Tudor showed us the very interesting video earlier of the Britain's Got Talent show with the jumping Hungarians, who were very entertaining. Most people probably won't know which act actually won this very large competition. Maybe it says something about British culture that this enormous talent competition was won by a dancing dog. What that tells you about our culture and our attitude towards animals, who knows? My summary, my intervention, which I think is a lovely word to be using as an English speaker that has all sorts of overtones for me, is very much a personal perspective. My personal perspective, having read the abstracts, having sat through and taken copious notes during the presentations, and indeed from conversations that I've had the opportunity to have with many of you. That said, all the errors, misunderstandings, and so on are mine and mine alone. My comments are preliminary, or even fuzzy, perhaps. It's a perfectly lovely word, which has a very clear meaning, even if it can't be translated. And brief, you will be glad to know. And obviously, I will be preparing a more lengthy written view once I've had time and indeed the opportunity to read the papers and actually some time to think about what we've talked about and what has happened. In my remarks, you may notice a slight bias towards yesterday's presentations because I haven't really had a chance to think about today's presentations yet. But hopefully you will see there are certainly resonances with some of the things that we've heard about today. This behind me is your Wordle, which I don't know what it actually tells us, but I thought it was quite attractive. So what I did is I took your abstracts and I threw them into this web service, and it kind of pulls out terms by frequency of use and so on. So we can see language featured fairly prominently, teaching, learning, difference, education, and so on. I don't know what it tells us, but it kind of gives us an overview. Those people who are looking for culture in this particular overview might struggle to find it. It is there, it just happens to be very small, hidden in the letter N. And that might be something perhaps we might like to reflect on. My role here, as I see it, is to try to draw together some themes, some overarching concerns. And this has been quite entertaining when I've described this role to other people. A lot of people have noticed me frantically taking notes and writing down all sorts of things. And they say, "So what are you doing here? Are you presenting?" I say, my role is to summarize and draw together the themes. And the response has been exactly the same, regardless of who I've spoken to, what their cultural background. All of them have raised their eyebrows and said, good luck. And that is interesting. That shows that it is not just my perspective, that this has been a very diverse collection of views and opinions. This seems to be a view that's shared by at least those people I've spoken to. And if I wanted to sort of summarize my impression, my overall reaction, if you like, to the presentations that I've heard, it would certainly be about diversity. But it's not a single diversity. It's not a diversity along a single dimension. It's been diverse along multiple complex dimensions. And that is a challenge, I think, in terms of trying to set a particular view over it. There is also, I think, and I've struggled to think about how I would explain this, a sort of dynamic tension between various factors. The idea that I'm trying to get here is not that these are sort of static forces set up in opposition to each other, but there are pressures and movements and fluidity between different viewpoints, different positions that are interrelated somehow. And again, that was just kind of an impression, a feeling that I got as an overall response to what I've heard. One of the perspectives of diversity, if you like, is the nature of the work that we've actually heard presented. Some of it has been very theoretical. Some of it has been very practical. Some of it has had a technical slant. Some of it has been organizational. Some of it has perhaps even taken us into a political perspective. And all of these are important, and all of these, I hope we'd agree, are relevant. But perhaps one thing that is not clear, to me at least, is how we move from one level of analysis to another. How we move from a political dimension down to a practical, technical dimension, or in the other direction, or indeed, if that's perhaps even a sensible thing to want to do. Another aspect to this diversity and complexity is the purpose. What you have said you are interested in achieving. And I've written in front of me, I've probably got 20 or 30 different explanations, even though there weren't that many presentations. Some people spoke about reducing misunderstanding and miscommunication. For others, it was about multilingualism as a necessity to work in Europe, as part of the European project, if you like. For others, it was about developing multilinguals. For some, it was about perhaps developing an understanding of multilingualism, which are not necessarily the same things. For some, it was about supporting non-state or minority languages. For some, it was about developing cultural awareness. For some, it was correcting errors, conforming to a norm, a standard for the language. In one case, it was perhaps about reconfiguring and challenging the nation state. Very different perspectives. And I'm not quite sure what to make of this. In a sort of a charitable view would be to say, this is fabulous, this is rich, this is diverse, yes, this is interdisciplinary and has multiple perspectives. A less charitable view would be to say, whoa, where are you going with this? Are you all actually trying to achieve the same thing here? I don't know to what extent that matters, but it is perhaps something to reflect on. You know, is there a single agenda here, or are these multiple agendas that it might be worth perhaps unpacking and being explicit about? In terms of some of these dynamic tensions I sort of mentioned, one that sort of kept coming up, I thought, was a tension between traditional methods and new methods, however we might want to characterize those. And it seemed that there was a whole spectrum of possibilities, whether these new technologies are kind of supplemental to traditional teaching, traditional ways of encouraging multilingual development, or whether they were going to transform them in some way, or perhaps at most extreme, whether they were just going to replace them. Maybe everything we've known about traditional teaching actually needs to be set to one side, and we perhaps need to start again. And we could perhaps place this on a scale, if you like, between conservative views of what this might entail to some quite radical views. And we kept coming back to some very traditional concerns about student motivation, student attitudes. All of us who work as teachers who work in education will know these are perennial issues. And perhaps technology has something to say about those, perhaps it doesn't. And maybe that's something we might explore. I've put up here the virtual is real. And I spent far too long early this morning phrasing and rephrasing this one bullet point to try to express what I mean, and I still don't think I've got it. Someone earlier very nicely put it, that barriers are breaking down. And I think one of the barriers that we need to think about, to consider, to reappraise perhaps, is this idea of the virtual and the real. I wrote a paper earlier this year, and one of the reviewers, I'd written about virtual networks and real-world networks, and one of the reviewers wrote back and said, is this sensible? In what sense are these virtual networks not real? Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of challenged my own thinking and my own use of terminology. And what's clear with our virtual systems is that we need to consider them in the real context, in the linguistic, historical, political, economic, social environment in which that system exists. These cannot be considered simply as virtual objects. That makes no sense, and that might affect our design, it might affect their use, it might affect how we evaluate them. And of course, we talk about learning in virtual worlds, learning in cyberspace. Nobody does that. All our learners are in the real world. The learning happens in their office, at the bus stop. It doesn't happen in the virtual. It happens in the real. These are real people. These things that we might think of as virtual are real to these people. Maybe that distinction isn't useful to us. And again, that should inform our thinking about design, about use, about evaluation. Perhaps one exception I would make here to the use of the term virtual is in the idea of virtual worlds. Okay, maybe that's a legitimate use. If we're talking about Second Life, for example, as several people have, maybe we can use that term. But I think generally, why would we consider a text or an email any more virtual than a phone call? It's data packets, it's going over the same network. We wouldn't say a phone call is virtual. I communicated with my mother in some virtual way yesterday. No, I spoke to her on the phone. It's real. And perhaps email, chat rooms, and so on are just as real, and we shouldn't think of them as being virtual. Virtual worlds are interesting, and for me, they raise this issue of authentic environments. Again, something people touched on in different ways. A couple of examples, people spoke about there being a virtual sauna. About learning to kite surf in Second Life. I want to know, if I'd learnt to kite surf in Second Life, does that actually mean I can kite surf? Yeah, can I actually then go to the beach, get on it and know what I'm doing? Or are we talking about something very different here? Are we talking about kite surfing in Second Life? Oh, I can do it in Second Life. I can't do it in the real world. Because that's important. We don't just want to develop speakers, multilinguals, who can do things in the virtual world. Ultimately, we want them to go into the real world. So perhaps we should think about what it means to create a virtual, authentic environment. To what extent is that authentic? What does authentic mean in that sense? So how might I conceptualize everything that we've spoken about? If I wanted to kind of put it into a single model, I think of it in terms of transformation. Transformation, perhaps at the more radical end of the spectrum of possibilities. So I'm not talking here about the conservative use, we'll use a little bit of technology in the classroom. What happens at the other end of change? Well, if we look at our traditional model, the way I learned languages, badly, okay, in terms of my ability to speak languages, it was very controlled. There was an educational institution. There was a course with a syllabus. There were the course materials. There were the teachers, the timetable, the classroom, the class, the students, the grades. Okay, I managed to achieve an ungraded French O-level. I didn't even manage to achieve a grade. So again, that says something about my personal linguistic abilities and possibly something about the way I was taught. I'd like to think so. And what happens if we shift through perhaps 1,000, 1,000,000 different intermediate points of balance between a very controlled, centralized model of learning and education to what I've called a learner-driven learning. I hate that phrase. That's a horrible phrase. I don't like it. One of the things I will think about is to try to come up with a better phrase, but I don't have one yet. The idea is that it is the learner who has the control, and to some extent that the control is decentralized. The control doesn't exist in any one place. It doesn't exist in the institution. It doesn't exist in the teacher. The control is distributed. What might this mean for the institution? It might be still that our learner engages with one institution. It might be they engage with many institutions in formulating their own learning. It might be that they engage with no institutions, that their learning has nothing to do with an institution. When we were asked the question earlier, how would we like to learn the language we wanted to learn? Would we like it traditional, blended, or online? Someone behind me said, none of those. Yeah? And maybe that's what this is about. This is this other dimension. Who are these other players? We've talked about public and private sector, but we might also talk about commercial players. A couple of times people have kind of mentioned commercial players, but with a certain amount of reluctance, wanting to distance themselves from commercial partners. Once we move into this open, learner-driven learning environment, the commercial players have as much right to be there as anyone. If they want to sell their products, who are we as educationists to say, well, no. You can't move into this market in this way. We are the people who educate. You, as a commercial company, don't understand how to do this properly. And private individuals. Okay, it's not about organizations. It could be about one single person doing something that a learner engages with and interacts with. What about the course materials? Okay, the learner is going to choose multiple sources, multiple types, dynamic choices. Their choices might vary from day to day, and so on. And again, this raises issues. One of the things we might like about centralized control is it gives us mechanisms and processes to talk about quality, to measure quality, to measure achievement. Do we need grades? Okay, someone actually mentioned earlier there is a low demand for certificates. Perhaps there's a low demand from some sorts of students. For other sorts of students, it's all about the certificate. Yeah, is this in the exam? Do I need to learn this for the exam so I can get my certificate? So again, this challenges us. Is it about grading? Is it about scoring? Or does that perhaps not matter? We're going to face challenges about intellectual property rights. Okay, as a lecturer, I feel ownership of my materials. It was mentioned earlier, this idea that we might share with some colleagues, and there are other colleagues we might be more reluctant to share with. I could think of a case in my own institution where this issue actually has led to disciplinary hearings and investigations around reluctance or not to share material. These are quite deep-rooted issues with some of us. But how about the notion that I might create a course where I've actually created none of the materials? That might be a possibility. Maybe it's not about the materials anymore. Maybe we need to change our thinking there. I've mentioned the classroom. Okay, a lot of people have talked about playgrounds, about safe environments for having fun, for exploring, for messing about, perhaps. And maybe that is an aspect. Maybe we should be thinking about less about classrooms and more about playgrounds. But what does that actually mean in practical terms? It sounds good, it sounds exciting. What does that actually mean? We could think about the roles. It's not just about teachers and students. Again, I jotted down some ideas. People talked about facilitators. People talked about having native speakers engaged in these places. Perhaps we need to think about playmates. We need to think about peers. We need to think about what our role as a teacher might be. Okay, one possibility in this learner-centered environment is that I, as a teacher, say, okay, we're going to learn French. There's the internet, go. Yeah, that's all I need to do. Tell you you've got to learn French and tell you there is the internet. But maybe our role becomes transformed. I was put in mind of some work by Vannevar Bush, who wrote about one of the precursors to hypertext and the internet and so on. And he had the notion of a new profession, a profession of trailblazers. And their specific role was to look through materials and create connections and links and paths through the material. And maybe that is part of our new role as a teacher. It's not about creating the content. It's about steering our learners or providing them possible paths through the content that is out there and created by others. But in all of this, there are fabulous, exciting potentials. It's important not to lose sight of the possibility that we might be losing things. Okay, what might those things be? Maybe they're to do with social ties. Maybe they're to do with senses of classroom community. I don't know. But I think it's important that we keep a critical perspective. We shouldn't just embrace the technology and assume that everything it's going to bring us is good and positive. I had this notion of agility when I was trying to think about how we position in this. Agility, in a very loose sense, as being our ability to respond quickly to change. And from what people have said, I think we can view the technology as being highly changeable. That's one of the changes we need to respond to. Again, Tunda showed us some lovely cartoons and some videos which I think made that point very humorously and also very effective. We can also think about content as being an agent of change, as being something that's going to change rapidly and something that we need to respond to. And that raises questions then about whether we and the people involved in this process are agile. Are our learners agile? Can they respond quickly to change? At least one presenter questioned the idea that our learners are actually ready to deal with this. And that's something we need to think about in terms of perhaps skilling our learners. Are we as teachers agile? Are we willing to make these changes? Are we able to make these changes? Are we informed enough to make these changes? Where does training fit into this? Where does the amount of time we have factor these sorts of things in? I have in my organisation a very prescriptive time plan that says exactly how long I can spend developing an hour's worth of content for my students. Okay? I am allowed to spend 1 hour developing an hour's worth of material. Okay? Is that practical? Is that practical to prepare a lecture? You know, a traditional lecture? I don't think so, personally. But, you know, this affects my personal agility in terms of how I can respond to change, how I can develop. Are the organisations and the processes agile? Are they prepared to innovate, to tolerate failure? Can they afford to invest the time and money in allowing staff to develop these materials? How can they integrate the need to respond on a very short time scale with the need to have a longer-term strategic plan for the institution and the organisation? Now, again, there are tensions there, I think, for organisations. And we might consider, is the system, the software that we've created, sorry, I've missed one, is the material agile? So many things to consider. Can our material be easily repurposed? Can it be reused? Are we creating material that is fixed into a particular format? Or are we creating reusable learning objects, as one of the buzzwords would phrase it? Things that can be reused in different formats, in different environments, by different learners, by different institutions, perhaps. And is the system agile? We're probably all familiar with closed commercial solutions. My institution uses Blackboard. Okay, a big commercial product, it locks you into it, it prevents your materials from getting out, you know, and it has various positive characteristics as well. But should we be developing bespoke software, writing our own software? Does that lock us in to it? Should we be developing for specific technologies? That stops us being agile. Should we be adapting software that is out there? Should we just be using it as it is? Let's just use Facebook as it is. Let's just use Twitter as it is, rather than trying to convert the tools and perhaps be less agile. We might want to think about open source, about freeware, about platform independence, about interoperability, all of those things that would help us, perhaps, to be agile. Where's this change going to happen? Okay, it's very easy to think, oh, this is to do with teachers, this is to do with learners, this is to do with departments. I think it's to do with institutions. I think that is the level at which these things are going to happen. As an individual teacher, I can only do so much within the constraints of my organization. If the organization changes its perspective, decides to try to move towards an agile approach, perhaps, then that will affect me, whether I like it or not. So it's perhaps at that level we need to look to for the changes to happen, to be driven from. But how? That is difficult. I don't have an answer to tell you how to do that, but it's an important question, and perhaps at an institutional level, we have to ask ourselves, is that really where we want to go? And do we actually have a choice? Are we going there anyway, regardless of whether or not we want to? Some unresolved issues. Okay, again, this is a personal perspective of where I think I saw gaps, or holes, or opportunities, let's say. Evidence base. As a computer scientist, I like to see the evidence. Okay, you've told me this system is usable. You've told me this system brings certain benefits. Show me. Show me the benefits. Show me the proof. Okay, a nice English expression, idiom, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Okay, I want to know how palatable it was. Did people feel full afterwards? And this is going to be particularly significant if we are imagining as an organization we are going to be selling our content and our courses. We need to be able to prove that this thing works, that yes, you will want to do my course, I'm going to charge you for it, and I can prove that this is good. This is going to influence our technology choices. Okay, we've heard lots of different perspectives on technology. How do I know which one of those is right for me? Our very first keynote speaker said, you can't learn anything from success. And when I heard him say that, I thought, yeah, great, absolutely. But the more I thought about it, the more it's worried me. And maybe we can learn something from success if we understand why it was successful. Okay, I should be able to learn from your success. You should be able to learn from my success. Okay, what worked? What educational value did this deliver? In what sense did it work? We have lots of different things we're trying to achieve. Maybe what you're trying to achieve isn't what I'm trying to achieve. So I need to know about that. What are the necessary conditions for it to be successful? Maybe my conditions are different to yours. And what our very first keynote speaker also spoke about, the failures. As an academic, my failures are swept under a carpet somewhere. I don't publish my failures. Maybe I can see how it might work for me. It didn't work for you because of that. Right, that doesn't apply to my situation. Okay, maybe I'm going to give this a try. Maybe I'll still fail. Maybe I won't. Okay, there are opportunities there. And again, it's about breaking down these barriers, about telling other institutions what we've done. Again, something that perhaps doesn't fit nicely within an institutional culture. Someone very early mentioned interactive whiteboards, how exciting interactive whiteboards are. Okay, my institution, we have interactive whiteboards. We had them, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, and they were exciting, they were new, we loved them. We went on training courses, we developed new materials. Now I will practically guarantee you, in the Faculty of Computing and Mathematical Sciences, none of us use them. All they are now is really big, irritating whiteboards that we can't write on. Yeah? So I don't know, I can't formulate that in a way that is useful to you. But maybe if I thought about it and analysed it and studied it, I could. And you could make decisions about whether or not interactive whiteboards are useful for you. Okay? One of our speakers earlier talked about there being hundreds of mobile learning apps that we might consider. How are we supposed to deal with that? I don't know how I start. That's just the mobile learning apps. What about all the other stuff? How am I supposed to make these choices? We need the evidence base. I'm interested in the experience of both teachers and learners in the wild. Someone else used this expression. I assure you I'd written it down beforehand. In the wild, in the real world, in their real learning, not just in the classroom, in the things we tend to study. How are we going to study this distributed learner-driven learning? Most of it's not happening in places we're going to notice. How do we study that? How do we understand what we're doing in the context of this much wider set of learning materials and behaviours? There's also, I think, a big gap around evidence about institutional change. If we're going to move in this direction, if we're going to try to be more agile, more responsive, if we're going to embed some of this stuff in the core being and rationale of our organisations, how do we do that? Where are the studies that are talking about that? We need to know about those sorts of things. Oh, no. I can't read previous. Which one? Previous.
Previous is the top one.
Good. Oh, close enough. Okay, I'll just leave it like that. That's fine. Briefly then, sustainability. To what extent are we going to maintain some of these benefits over time? A lot of these learning environments using Second Life, whatever, are exciting for students because they're new. To what extent are we going to maintain that? If we're still using Second Life in 5 years' time, are people still going to think it's new and exciting? Are they still going to have that sort of buzz around it? What about maintaining some of these systems? What about scalability? When we add more students, when we add more languages, when we add new content, when we add more teachers, how do these things scale up in practice? The digital divide, digital natives. Okay? Most of my undergraduate students, okay, in a class of 150, most of them don't wear a watch. Okay? Why would you wear a watch? You've got a mobile phone, that's how you tell what the time is. But also, most of them don't use Twitter. So it's very easy to make assumptions about the digital natives. They're all doing all of this. They all have the technology, they all love the technology, they all understand the technology. That's not necessarily the case. We, again, need to take a critical perspective on young people's use of technology and our own use of technology. Are we digital natives as teachers, as educators? Or are we part of the digitally excluded? I take the example of 3 parents of children in my daughter's class. Okay, my eldest daughter, who is 7. Myself, at a rough count, we have 3 desktop computers, 2 laptops, 1 notepad, 1 tablet, and 2 smartphones for 2 adults and 2 small children. Okay, and I don't think we're particularly geeky. Okay, another parent, professionals, they don't have the internet at home. Another parent doesn't have a bank account.
Wow.
Okay, this is in Wales. This is the reality. Let us not lose sight of the digitally excluded. Are we just going to create a multilingual elite because they have access to the technology, they use the technology? What about the excluded? Okay, so again, we need to maintain a questioning stance, I think. Finally, you'll be glad to know, culture. Culture question mark. My feeling, personal perspective, is we heard a lot about language, we heard a lot about multilingualism. We heard very little about culture and multiculturalism. Okay? My Wordle. culture was small. And I don't know why this is. You know, maybe it's difficult. Maybe I'm not understanding what culture is, perhaps. But it seemed to me that in some ways, perhaps language is easy and culture is difficult. How to understand English culture? What does it mean that we voted for a dancing dog? How are other people supposed to understand that? I don't understand it, personally. But I think there is still thought and exploration that needs to be done, particularly in that area. That's the end of my rambling, far too long overview of what I think I saw. One thing I'd just like to end with is, once you've had a chance to reflect on this, if you think, oh, he's missed this, or he's misunderstood that, or, no, actually, I think that's interesting and here are some thoughts on it, please send me an email, okay? I view this as being a collaborative process to some extent. It's about my reading of your abstracts, it's about me listening to your papers, it's about me reading your papers, having the conversation with you. So, by all means, flood my already full inbox. And I would welcome any comments or thoughts, observations, criticisms, critiques that you might wish to share with me. Thank you all very much.
Thank you enormously for that very hard task of provoking our thoughts, I think, and we look forward to the written version of that. And I hope that many of us will take up Daniel's invitation and will send him your thoughts about that. Can I end up? We have to end up. Lunch is getting cold, and some people will have to leave soon. Can I do it in Catalan very quickly? Although there are some things for our visitors. Okay, so Claudia is smiling, but I will say important things to her now in Catalan, so you can practice your Catalan. Bé, hi ha unes coses per a les persones que han vingut aquí d'altres països convidades per la mateixa Universitat Oberta, que és la necessitat de, quan torneu a casa, mireu el missatge que rebreu de la senyoreta Montporta sobre els rebuts, les factures, les targetes d'embarcar, els bitllets electrònics. Tot aquest paquet és molt interessant per vosaltres que ens arribi per correu certificat en bones condicions i llavors Montporta canalitzarà el pagament als vostres comptes corrents si teniu compte bancari. No tothom, not everyone, has a compte bancari, bank account. Segona cosa, una repetició per tothom, que els formularis d'avaluació us convidem críticament, però que ens doneu el vostre feedback, que agraïm enormement. La tercera cosa, per als que heu presentat una comunicació o un ponent o heu fet una intervention, I take your point, és, sisplau, de donar-nos tan aviat com pugui ser o el PowerPoint amb tots els links o el text escrit o la documentació necessària perquè les persones que no han pogut venir puguin llegir, seguir, captar el missatge que heu volgut donar aquí, en aquest simposi. I l'última cosa que volem que tots contribuïu a fer des de les vostres organitzacions és difondre al màxim l'existència i la feina del projecte EUNoM, sobretot donant la nostra adreça de web allà on creieu que pot ser interessant. Intentarem informar molt aviat quasi 3.000 persones més de l'existència del projecte i sobretot pensant en anunciar l'última conferència que serà a Brussel·les el 18 d'octubre. I finalment vull donar les gràcies, òbviament, l'Eva en primer lloc, que és l'última persona que ha arribat, que ha ajudat la Gemma, en Martí, em sembla que tenim aquí, moltes gràcies pel video streaming, el Ramon, que em sembla que no hi és, que ens ha facilitat tota la infraestructura tecnològica, i després a les intèrprets, la Montserrat i la Blanca, allà al fons, moltíssimes gràcies. Ara farem un gran aplaudiment general. A la Patrícia i a la Mònica de la mateixa universitat, que han facilitat molts contactes institucionals, i finalment a la Mont Porta, que molts ja coneixeu, la Teresa González i potser sobretot la Natàlia Marrugat, que totes dues han marxat, la Natàlia i la filla, han marxat d'hora perquè estava cansada. Òbviament, quan tingui la filla no podrà continuar amb el projecte, però tenim la fortuna de comptar amb la Marta Torres, aixeca't Marta novament, que serà la interlocutora amb vosaltres per tot això. I per tant vull donar-vos a tots les gràcies i sobretot la gent que ha fet possible aquest simposi. Moltíssimes gràcies.